Sometimes something seems like a good idea, but it's really a really, really bad idea. One place we see this is in the books of Genesis and Exodus. In the book of Genesis, we're following this family, the family of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And then Jacob has all these kids, these 11 sons to start with. And the 10 sons get mad at their younger son and sell him into slavery. You know, same old story. And Joseph is the younger of the sons, and he goes to Egypt as a slave. But he starts making some good decisions, and God starts working in his life. And then one day, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has this dream. And he doesn't understand it. And he can't find anybody to interpret it. And finally they drag Joseph, who's like running a prison at this point, as a prisoner. They drag him to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tells him the dream, and Joseph gives him the right interpretation. He says, oh, your dream's about 7 years of plenty, when the crops are going to be amazingly good, which are going to be followed by 7 years of drought and famine, when there's not going to be any food. And then Joseph says, oh, by the way, here's an idea for you. You probably ought to pick out somebody who's a really good organizer and thinker and put them in charge, so during the 7 years of plenty, you can just accumulate all the extra stuff, all the extra food, and then you can use it during the 7 years of famine. And the Pharaoh goes, well, that's a brilliant idea. Joseph, why don't you run that? And he promotes Joseph all the way from the prison to the palace. He suddenly becomes like the second most powerful man in Egypt. And that's great. And the next thing's good, because God's actually going to use Joseph to protect his family, who are back home in Israel, and they're getting ready to starve to death. So they come down to get some food. And then Joseph has what seems like a really good idea. He says, why don't you guys all move down here? You can live under my protection. We can have all the food you want. We've got a good place where you guys could live. So why don't y'all move down here? So they do. They take every man, woman, child, ox, goat, sheep, calf, everything they got, and they move everything down to Egypt. And it goes really well because Joseph's in power and Joseph's protecting them, even though the Hebrews are a little weird in the eyes of the Egyptians. And it worked so well, leaving the promised land to move to Egypt. Until the inevitable happened. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, it says, then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. And suddenly the Hebrews, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, lost their political power and now were just weird. And it didn't take long for the Egyptians to turn every one of them into slaves. And they stayed slaves for 400 years. Now that slavery was part of God's plan because it forged them into a nation that was still alive today, a people that still call themselves by the same name that they held then. But it was quite a price to pay. And why did it go wrong? Because they decided to trust something other than God. And that's today's Jumpstart.